Hello friends, I'm Paul Estabrooks, and today my story is about prison power. After decades of working with persecuted Christians around the world, many of them having been in prison for their faith, prison stories are some of the most inspirational that I've experienced. But today's story is perhaps the most inspirational of all of these stories. The story of Pastor Ha from Vietnam. In the early 1970s, I made my first trips to Vietnam when we were looking for broadcasters and programs for FEBC radio being broadcast into the country. I would meet with President Minh of the Evangelical Church of Vietnam, known as Tin Lan. That church had been planted by the #1 missionary organization in the region called the Christian and Missionary Alliance. That denomination planted the most churches in Indochina than any other denomination, and it was one of their great missionary record fields. Tin Lan was the national church that developed from that missionary effort up until 1975. Reverend Minh was a very godly man and a wonderful man to share time with. And he pictures in this, and in just a moment I'll show you his picture. In 1975, the communist takeover of the country occurred, as you'll remember, in late April. And at that time, a man named Pastor Ha, who had been a missionary to a tribal area up in the mountains of central Vietnam, returned to his home city of Saigon. Saigon was named then Ho Chi Minh City, after the communist takeover. After much prayer, Pastor Ha went to the authorities and asked for the opportunity to use the international church that was built by the Christian Missionary Alliance in Saigon as a church base for 29 people who he knew would like to worship together on Sundays. I actually spoke in that church in 1974 when it was then known as the International Church of Saigon. And Pastor Ha, miraculously, and no one knows why except God, was given permission to start and plant a church in that big building. It was a large building, held many people. They had 29 people when they started in 1975. It was a church plant. And how do you plant a church? Well, here's the program that Pastor Ha implemented. Every morning of every day of the week, from 5 o'clock in the morning until 8 o'clock in the morning, there was a 3-hour prayer meeting. The church doors were open. Anyone could come and join in prayer for those 3 hours, or even part of those 3 hours, every single day. Every night, the building was open again for a Bible study. And they had a Bible study every evening. And that church plant program was very effective in those years in the city of Saigon or Ho Chi Minh. They would have 80 to 100 conversions every month from people coming to the church and being attracted to the program that they were offering and to getting to know about Jesus through the pastor, their Sunday services as well as these morning and evening services. And the church began to grow. In 3 years, they grew from 29 people to over 5,000. And they had to have 4 services every Sunday to get everyone into the building. And by that time, 1978 or early 79, they were having 21 services a week in that building. Now you can just imagine that communist authorities, who were atheists, were not exactly ecstatic about the fact they'd given permission for this. And so they thought, well, we've got to trap this guy into saying something political so we can shut his church down. And every week they would send spies, we would call them, into the service to listen to the pastor and try and catch him saying something political that they could hold against him and cause the church to be closed. That was their purpose. Now, how did he know this? Well, he shared later that one Sunday, he gave an altar call. It was a Sunday evening service, in fact, and he gave an altar call. And one of those 12 men who were there came forward and gave his life to Jesus. And he told the pastor about the other 11 guys that were there that night. So Pastor Ha knew all along that his situation was precarious. It was very challenging. And he was very careful about what he said, especially during church services. It was a challenging time in the country, of course, and they chose one scripture verse to put on the wall of the church. It was written, of course, in Vietnamese, and it said, "In everything give thanks." That was their life verse, so to speak, as a church. In everything give thanks. And that's what they did. And the church just grew incredibly, and Pastor Ha was having a fabulous ministry there. In 1983, two of our colleagues from Australia named Greg and Bob had a chance to go to Vietnam, and they met with Pastor Ha and Reverend Ming, who was the leader of the Tin Lan, which Pastor Ha's church was part of. Pastor Ha's church was known as the Tran Kavan Church, and it was the old International Church building. Greg and Bob took this picture. It's a picture that I just delight in looking at. Look at the smiles on these faces. These are not smiles that are forced because someone's taking your picture. These are four men with absolute joy on their faces. On the left is Pastor Ha. He looks very young. He always looked young. Even today, I believe, at his later age, he still is young looking, I've been told. And beside him is President Ming, who is now with the Lord. President Ming was the head of the Tin Lan, the national church in Vietnam that had been planted by the Christian Missionary Alliance. And beside them there is the next man with the dark glasses and the dark shirt, is Pastor Paul I. Now, he was not Christian Missionary Alliance. He was Assemblies of God Pentecostal, a denomination that normally is much more isolated. But in a situation like communist Vietnam, Christians hung together really well, and you can just see the fellowship and the camaraderie that's there. And Pastor Paul I, who later had an incredible church plant of his own, and today is living outside the country, was the third in the picture. And the final young man on the right is the Christian translator that Bob and Greg had during their time while they were there. They asked Pastor Ha, "Come on, tell us, what's the secret? What's the secret of your fantastic church growth? What is it that drives you? What's your basic theology?" And he smiled at them and said, "Well, my theology is really very simple. It's a simple theology, and it has two parts." And he said, "My theology is, when you have problems, pray. The second part is, when you have more problems, pray more." And that was the essence of this man's, quote, theology. And he was just a delightful person, they said, to be with. That was in the spring of 1983. By December the 10th of that year, the government could stand it no longer. They could find nothing to charge him with legally. And so on a Saturday morning prayer meeting on December the 10th, 1983, the soldiers moved into the church. They confiscated all the Bibles. They confiscated the hymn books. They ended up locking the gate of the church so no one could use that building again. The pastor and his wife lived in the back in an apartment, Pastor Ha and his wife and kids. And they searched their house, and they found just a few American dollars, which, of course, remember, this is a war being fought by American soldiers at the time, or before. And so American dollars were quite common in Vietnam. But that was enough to give them a charge against him of being a spy. Just because he had US dollars, just a few, in his home, he was arrested and charged with being a spy for the United States. Pastor Ha lost his home, and his family lost the home. That was one of the greatest challenges that was faced, because they had to move out, and he was taken to prison. His wife and kids had nowhere to live, and there was nowhere to go. They ended up living on a balcony of another Christian family's apartment building. That was the only place they had, an outdoor balcony. Now, the good news is Vietnam is a warm country most of the year round, but they lived for a long time on a balcony outside an apartment, and she was very content to stay there, praying every day for her husband, who was arrested. Meanwhile, in prison, he's being interrogated every day. And they say to him, "How come your church is still growing and you're in prison? You're not even there and it's still growing." And he would say, "Well, it's because people are finding Jesus. Jesus is making himself real to people in this country and in this situation. They're looking for hope in someone, and they're finding it in him." And indeed, the church grew, but of course it didn't grow in that building. The building was locked. This is a picture of Tron Kavan Church. And when I was there just a year later, not even a year, 4 months after it was closed, there were big chains and locks on that gate, and no one was allowed in, and no one was able to use it from that point forward. So what did the believers do? They formed into house churches, and they formed a house church network of people who had previously been attending the Tron Kavan Church. So Pastor Ha is in detention for 2 years, and finally, after 2 years, they bring him to court to officially charge him and to have a kangaroo court kind of proceedings. His people knew that this was happening, and when the truck that brought him from the prison to the courtroom came up to the building, there were 500 people waiting around to get a glimpse of their pastor, including his dear wife. And Pastor Ha got out of the car and started going in, and he noticed that his wife was crying. And I just suspect that, it was probably a very emotionally trying time for her. 2 years of not having her husband around, not having a place to live on her own. And no doubt he lost probably a lot of weight from the lousy food that they would give them in those kind of prison camps. Anyway, he realized that she was crying, and in front of all of the people, very gently and kindly, he said in a loud voice so everybody could hear him, Dear, please don't cry. You don't need to cry. There's no reason to cry." He said, "God has given me more ministry in the prison than I had before in my church. So I am willing to stay here in this prison and serve him." That was his testimony. He was again charged with being a spy and a whole bunch of other trumped up charges, and he was sentenced to a long period of time in prison. It wasn't long after that I had my first speaking tour, and this is kind of a humorous interjection in a very serious story. In 1985, I was invited to speak in England, Switzerland, and Holland about Indochina, that is, Cambodia and Vietnam and Laos, 10 years after their fall to the communists. And Pastor Ha was now in prison and serving a long sentence. And we were not to talk about him much publicly in order not to get him in trouble or his family in trouble. And so everywhere I went, I told his story about the incredible church growth that occurred and asked people to pray for him in prison. And I called him Pastor H, just as a code word, so I wasn't saying his full name. He actually had 3 names, and all 3 started with the letter H. So I talked about Pastor H. Well, that was fine in England. It was fine in Switzerland. Then I got to Holland. And on my first night of speaking at Holland, I had a wonderful interpreter named Ben Hobrink. Ben was so good in both languages of English and Dutch that he could start translating before you even finished your sentence. And he was really fluid and fantastic. And so the first time I said, I want to tell you about an incredible pastor from Vietnam named Pastor H. And he translated into Dutch saying, Pastor Ha. Well, I looked at him. I must have given him dagger shots, because I'd already told him that we weren't going to use his name. We were going to use a code name of some kind. And he said, he used the word Pastor Ha, which was his real name. So after the service, I immediately went to Ben. I said, Ben, why did you say Pastor Ha's name? He says, Paul, all I did was translate you. Don't you know that in Dutch, the letter H is pronounced Ha? I realized that no matter how smart you think you are, you're going to blow it at some point or other. Anyway, fortunately, we did not get Pastor Ha in trouble. But he spent 6 years in prison. And in those 6 years and 23 days, he led 96 people to faith in Jesus. Can you believe that? In fact, the authorities are now so upset with him that they kick him out of the prison and they force him and deport him out of the country. And of course, the one country very willing to accept him was the United States of America. And Pastor Ha went to the U.S. and there he began ministry, just counting the days before he could get back to Vietnam. He did not, I don't believe he's even still learned English, because he still wants to go back to Vietnam and serve God in his home country. But he did that. And so we've had opportunities to hear him share after his return, his coming to the United States. He came, for example, to a prayer conference that we were at. And I want to share with you his own testimony about his prison experience. What was his prison power? And these are his words, and I'm going to read them because they're so important. I don't want to blow it by paraphrasing. Here's what he said. If God had called me to prison ministry in 1975, I would have refused. But he spent those years preparing my heart, so when the time came, I accepted. I saw all this as the amazing plan of God. During my 6 years and 23 days of living in iron cages, the Lord called 96 people to believe in him. They were members of the former government, officials from the new communist government, refugees, Chinese, Cambodian, even a few of our prison guards. My prison wasn't like one in the United States with television sets everywhere. We slept on the cold floor, dealing with mosquitoes, leeches, and cockroaches. Prisoners were always hungry, fighting disease constantly, and battling each other. One time I was isolated in a very dark room. For 16 months, I could not see anything. The food was rotten, but praise God, I wasn't sick once during that whole time. God put me in prison to share Jesus Christ with the outcasts and the hopeless, to express his love. His glory became known in that prison. The guards tried many ways to keep us from communicating with one another, but the witness went on. Over the years, the prisoners had dug holes in thick walls from one cell to another. Their purpose was to pass cigarettes, but I used them to speak about the Lord. When I was in isolation, I found that the people below me could hear through the toilet hole. They memorized verses of the Bible, learned songs, and came to Christ all through that hole. And after his years of imprisonment, Pastor Ha said, "When I had my freedom, I worked with prayer, sometimes in the background. In prison, I discovered that prayer is everything. It's like a pilot using a checklist before he takes off. If he skips the first item, many lives are in danger. The first item on our checklist should always be prayer. If we skip it, the whole mission is in jeopardy. Pastor Ha's church, Tran, being closed, began a process of house churches that have developed widely across Vietnam. In the 1990s, I received a Christmas card from a leader of some of those very house churches, a network of them. And in the Christmas card, they said, "Thank you for your prayers for us. God has given us this year 20,203 new believers. Hallelujah." That's what prison power has done in a country like Vietnam. And here's Pastor Ha, who today, I just read in the internet, has been voted as the leader of a network of more than 100 Vietnamese churches in America, United States. And he has been voted as their leader. And that's what he does today. Still hoping, I'm sure, to go back to Vietnam. But he's holding up two fingers in this last picture I took of him. And his two fingers are saying his theology. When you have problems, pray. When you have more problems, pray more.